She was 90 seconds from the airlock when she realized she didn't recognize the corridor. The ship waiting outside massed 40,000 tons. She had read its classified profile exactly once, 3 days ago, during a shift that was supposed to be about cataloging agricultural exchange requests. Humans had built Outpost Theta 9 to be forgettable. That was its entire purpose. A diplomatic way station so unremarkable that no one would bother attacking it, spying on it, or remembering it existed. 72 hours earlier, she had been filing records and thinking about lunch. Now she was bleeding on someone else's floor. The blood wasn't hers. The footsteps behind her were measured, unhurried, not the panicked sprint of someone chasing, the patient walk of someone who knew exactly where she was going. Alara then pushed through a pressure door and nearly slipped on a patch of coolant. Her archival robe, gray, formal, designed for sitting in climate-controlled record rooms, was torn at the shoulder. The fabric made a wet sound when she moved. She didn't stop to check if it was coolant or blood. Wrong corridor, wrong deck, wrong ship. The thought surfaced and sank. She had been aboard the alien vessel for 11 minutes, and in that time she had learned 3 things. First, its interior layout did not match any diplomatic configuration in the human database. Second, the crew did not speak to each other in her presence. They used hand signals and eye movements, a language her translator ignored. Third, Commander Vethkor's third eye had tracked her pulse since the moment she stepped through the docking tube. The storage bay was a dead end. She realized this 4 steps before she reached it, when the lighting changed from corridor white to bay dim, too late to turn. The pressure door behind her had already cycled closed. Alara stopped running. The bay was large, cold, filled with cargo containers stamped with symbols she didn't recognize. A maintenance hatch on the far wall locked, no other exits. She turned. Commander Vethkor stood in the doorway. His gray face was flat, unreadable, the 3 eyes arranged in a triangle that never seemed to blink simultaneously. His uniform was immaculate. Diplomatic dress, she had been told, 72 hours and a lifetime ago. "You weren't supposed to be here," he said. His voice was calm, not the calm of reassurance, the calm of a man stating a fact so obvious it required no emotion. "Neither were you," she said. The third eye blinked. 72 hours earlier, Alara had been filing records and thinking about lunch. Outpost Theta 9 orbited nothing of value. That was its selling point. The diplomatic corps had built it in a system with no habitable planets, no mineral wealth, no strategic chokepoints. The star was a red dwarf that had been dying for 1 billion years. The only thing in the system worth noting was the silence. Alara liked the silence. She had requested this posting 14 months ago after her mentor died. Dr. Erisvel had spent 40 years in archival services, most of them on backwater stations where nothing happened and nothing was expected to happen. He had taught her that archives weren't about the past, they were about the future. Someone would need this information someday. Your job was to make sure it survived until then. His office still smelled like the tea he drank. She hadn't changed the air filters. The morning of the arrival, she was alone in the record room, cross-referencing agricultural exchange requests from 3 species she had never met. The work was boring, she liked that too. The alert came at 8:47 station time. Unidentified vessels, approach vector from coreward sectors. Estimated arrival, 6 hours. 6 hours meant lunch was still safe. She finished the agricultural requests, submitted them, and walked to the mess hall. The hall was mostly empty. Outpost Theta 9 had a permanent staff of 42, administrators, translators, security, support. The diplomatic wing employed 12 people who rotated through on 2-month assignments. Alara was one of 3 permanent archivists, which meant she was usually the only one in the record room. She sat down across from Senior Administrator Hollies, who was eating something that looked like gray paste on bread. "Got the alert," Holly said. "Unidentified, that's new." "They're probably lost," Alara said. "That's what I'm worried about. No one gets lost out here. There's nothing to be lost to." The paste on his bread shifted as he gestured. Alara watched it and decided she wasn't hungry. The ships arrived at 1447, 3 of them not lost. Alara watched from the observation deck as they decelerated into parking orbit. The vessels were black, angular, with no visible markings or running lights. Their drive signatures didn't match any known species in the diplomatic database. "That's a military formation," said Security Chief Mora, standing beside her. "Look at the spacing, 2 forward, 1 trailing. That's not how you park diplomats." "It's how you park something that might need to leave fast," Alara said. Mora glanced at her. "You know something I don't." "No, I just file things." "That's what it looks like when I file things about military vessels." The diplomatic delegation requested clearance to dock at 1532. Their transmission was polite, formal, in 3 human languages. They identified themselves as representatives of the Veth sovereignty, a species Alara had never heard of. Their purpose, cultural exchange and boundary discussion. "Boundary discussion," Holly said, reading the transmission in his office. We don't have boundaries with species we've never met. Maybe they think we do, Alara said. She was standing in his doorway because she had been walking past when he called her in. That was the story she told herself. In truth, she had been hovering outside his office for 5 minutes, waiting to hear what the transmission said. Hollis looked at her over his reading glasses. You're an archivist, why are you interested in this? Someone has to file the first contact paperwork. He laughed. It was not a happy laugh. The delegation boarded at 1722. Commander Vethkor was the first through the docking tube. He was tall for a human comparison, maybe 6.5 feet, but his proportions were wrong, the limbs longer than they should be, the torso shorter. His face was flat, gray, with 3 eyes arranged in a triangle. The center eye, the one above the nose equivalent, never blinked. Alara was standing in the reception line because she had been told to stand in the reception line. Senior staff only, Hollis had said. She was not senior staff, but the other 2 archivists were off station and someone needed to document the arrival. Document the arrival, she almost laughed at the phrasing, as if this were a wedding. Vethkor stopped in front of her. His eyes, all 3, focused on her face for a moment, then dropped to the data cylinder clipped to her belt. You are recorder, he said. Archivist, she said. I keep records. Of what? Everything, that's the job. He looked at her for a moment longer, then he moved on to the next person in line. Alara wrote down everything she remembered about him. The way his hands hung at his sides, fingers slightly curled. The way his uniform had no wrinkles, no seams she could see, as if it had been grown rather than sewn. The way his third eye tracked her pulse. She did not write down that last part. It was not a fact she could prove, but she noted it in the margin of her mental file where she kept things that might be important later. The reception lasted 3 hours. There were speeches, there were introductions. There was a presentation on the history of Outpost Theta 9 that lasted 45 minutes and bored everyone in the room, including the humans who had written it. Alara stood in the back and watched. She watched the Veth delegation's security team. There were 8 of them, dressed in the same seamless uniforms as Vethkor, but their movements were different. They didn't scan the room the way human security did, eyes moving, hands visible. They stood perfectly still, facing outward, their heads never turning. They're not looking for threats, she thought. They're watching for something else. She watched the way the Veth spoke to each other, short sentences, hand signals she couldn't track, eye movements that seemed to carry meaning, a glance at a doorway, a flick toward a window, a long look at a ceiling panel. They have a language their translators aren't translating. She made a note, then she made another note. At 20:30, the reception ended. Hollis shook Vethkor's hand. The human gesture still startled the Veth, she noticed, and promised a full tour of the facility in the morning. Your people must be tired, Hollis said. Rest well. Vethkor inclined his head. We do not require rest at this hour, but we appreciate the accommodation. His team filed back through the docking tube. Alara watched them go. One of the security personnel, the one who had been standing nearest the window, glanced back at her, just for a second. Then the tube sealed and they were gone. She didn't sleep. At 2200, she was back in the record room, pulling files. Not the agricultural requests this time. Old files. Diplomatic contact reports from other stations, other first contacts, other species that had arrived unannounced with polite transmissions in military-grade vessels. The pattern emerged at 100. 3 other outposts in the last 9 years had received visits from species claiming diplomatic intent. In each case, the outpost had been decommissioned within 6 months. Official reason: budget cuts, strategic realignment, personnel shortages. Alara read the after-action reports, the ones that survived anyway. In each case, the outpost had been located near a dormant communications relay. Military-grade hardware, decommissioned years earlier, left in place because removing it cost more than leaving it. She pulled up Theta 9's infrastructure maps. The outpost sat directly above Relay Node 7 Alpha, decommissioned 11 years ago. No active military functions, just a chunk of metal and old electronics drifting in the dark. Why would anyone care about a dead relay? She didn't have an answer, but she had a question, and that was enough to keep her awake. At 600, she was still in the record room when Hollis walked in. You look terrible, he said. I've been working. On what? She hesitated. The delegation. I wanted to make sure we had everything ready for the tour. Hollis looked at her for a long moment, then he shrugged. Tours at 900, try to look like you slept. He left. Alara looked at the files on her screen. 3 outposts, 3 decommissionings, 3 dead relays. She copied everything to her personal data cylinder, the brass one, the one Dr. Eris had given her years ago, the one she kept for things that mattered. Someone will need this information someday. She hoped someday wasn't today. The tour began at 9:15. Vethkor and his team walked through the outpost's administrative wing, the living quarters, the mess hall, the observation deck. They asked questions, polite questions, the kind of questions diplomats asked. How many people lived here? How long had the station been operational? What was the water recycling capacity? Alara walked at the back of the group, taking notes. She watched the security team. They still didn't scan the room, but they did something else. They counted. She saw it happen 4 times. One of them, different one each time, would look at a doorway, then at the ceiling, then at the floor. A quick sequence, almost too fast to notice. Then they would move their hands slightly, fingers changing position. Counting, they're counting the people in the room. She made a note, then she looked at Vethkor. He was watching her. The third eye never blinked. At 1100, the delegation requested access to the station's communications array. Standard procedure, Vethkor said. We wish to transmit a preliminary report to our government. Hollis frowned. The communications array is restricted. Diplomatic traffic only. Our report is diplomatic. I'll need to clear it with Earth Command. Vethkor's expression didn't change. Of course, we will wait. The wait lasted 4 hours. Alara spent them in the record room pulling more files. She found the encrypted transmission at 1430. It was buried in the outpost's comm logs, a brief burst of data from 12 hours before the Veth delegation arrived. The transmission was routed through Relay Node 7 Alpha, the dead relay, the one that wasn't supposed to be active. The sender's signature was scrambled, the recipient was not. The message had been sent to a Veth military frequency. Someone told them we were here. Alara sat back in her chair. The record room was quiet, the air filters humming, the lights flickering slightly because maintenance had been deferred again. Someone on this station told a foreign military power that a diplomatic outpost was sitting on top of a decommissioned relay. She thought about the 3 outposts that had been decommissioned, the 3 relays, the 3 polite delegations that arrived with military vessels and left with what? What had they left with? She didn't know, but the data cylinder on her belt felt heavier than it should have. At 1600, Hollis approved the transmission request. Earth Command had cleared it, he said. Standard diplomatic channels, nothing to worry about. Alara stood in the doorway of his office again. Can I see the approval? Hollis looked up. Why? Because I'm the archivist, I need to file it. He stared at her for a moment, then he turned his screen around. The approval was there, standard language. Earth Command had no objection to the Veth delegation transmitting a diplomatic report via the outpost's communications array. But the approval had been routed through a different channel than usual, not the diplomatic chain, military. Alara memorized the routing codes. Thank you, she said. I'll file it now. She didn't file it. She copied it to her data cylinder next to the files about the other outposts, next to the encrypted transmission that shouldn't have existed. Someone will need this information. She hoped she was wrong about who. At 1800, she was in the mess hall when Mora sat down across from her. You've been quiet, the security chief said. I'm an archivist, we're quiet. You've been watching. Alara didn't deny it. So have you. Mora nodded. The security team is wrong. Wrong how? They're not protecting anyone, they're mapping. Alara set down her cup. Mapping what? Exit routes, structural weak points, power junctions. I've been watching them for 2 days. They don't care about where the threats are, they care about where the walls are. Mora leaned forward. That's not a security detail, that's a survey team. Alara thought about the 3 outposts, the 3 decommissionings, the 3 dead relays. How quickly could they take this station, she asked. Mora's expression didn't change. If they're military and we're not, 20 minutes, maybe less. Then why haven't they? That's what I'm trying to figure out. At 200 the next morning, Alara couldn't sleep. She walked the corridors instead. The outpost was quiet, the night shift minimal, the lights dimmed to simulate darkness. She passed the administrative wing, the living quarters, the observation deck. She passed the restricted access door to Relay Node 7 Alpha. The door was open. It wasn't supposed to be open. The relay had been decommissioned for 11 years. The door required 2 authorization codes and a biometric scan. The lock was intact, the door was just open. Alara stood in the corridor for 30 seconds, then she stepped through. The relay room was cold. The equipment was old, bank after bank of processors and storage units, most of them dark, some of them still showing power indicators. The air smelled like dust and ozone. Commander Vethkor was standing at the main terminal. He didn't turn when she entered. His third eye had seen her reflection in the screen, or maybe it had seen her through the wall. She didn't know what the eye could do, and she didn't want to find out. You're supposed to be asleep, he said. Night audit, she said. Standard procedure. He turned, the 3 eyes fixed on her face. Is it? Security protocol, we check restricted areas every 4 hours. That is not true. Alara's heart was loud in her ears. She kept her voice steady. Prove it. Vethkor looked at her for a long moment, then he smiled. It was not a reassuring smile. Very well, he said, I will not. He walked past her through the open door into the corridor. His footsteps were measured, unhurried. When he was gone, Alara leaned against the terminal and tried to breathe. The screen was still active. She looked at the data. Relay Node 7 Alpha had been transmitting for 9 years. Not decommissioned, not dead, hidden. The military routing codes had been scrubbed from the official logs, but the hardware was still there, still running, still sending data to an unregistered receiver somewhere coreward. The data was fleet telemetry, human fleet telemetry, positions, movements, patrol routes, supply lines. Someone had been mapping human military deployments for 9 years, and no one had noticed because the relay was supposed to be dead. Alara copied everything to her data cylinder. Then she wiped her access from the terminal logs, walked back to her quarters, and sent an encrypted warning to Earth Command. The transmission failed. The communications array had been jammed. She tried again, failed. A third time, failed. She looked at the data cylinder in her hand. Someone will need this information. She hid it in the ventilation system above her bunk, behind a loose grate that had been loose since she arrived. Then she waited for morning. Morning came at 7:30. The Veth delegation requested another tour. Different sections this time: the maintenance bays, the power distribution center, the water recycling plant. Alara walked at the back again, taking notes, watching. The security team was different today. They didn't count anymore. They didn't map. They stood at the doors and didn't move. They're done surveying. Now they're waiting. For what? At 1100, the delegation requested access to the lower maintenance decks. Restricted, Holly said. Safety regulations. No unauthorized personnel below Deck 4. Vethkor inclined his head. Of course, we understand. He understood something Holly's didn't. Alara saw it in the way his security team exchanged glances, not eye movements this time, but hand signals, fast and precise. They know something we don't. At 1400, the lower maintenance decks went dark. Not the lights, the comms. Every channel to decks 5 through 9 stopped responding. Holly's called maintenance. No answer. He called security. Static. Communications failure, he said. Probably a relay. Alara looked at the clock. 18 hours until the relay node's maintenance window closed. After that, no evidence. She thought about the data cylinder in the ventilation shaft. Someone will need this. She thought about the 3 outposts that had been decommissioned, the polite delegations, the ships that arrived and left nothing behind. They're not here to spy anymore. They're here to make sure no one ever finds out they were spying. At 1430, Alara walked to the ventilation shaft. The grate was still loose. The cylinder was still there. She pulled it out, checked the data, and put it back. Then she walked to the maintenance bay, found a crowbar, a real one, heavy, meant for prying open stuck pressure doors, and tucked it under her robe. At 1500, the Veth security team began sealing off sections of the outpost. Not locking, sealing. Emergency bulkheads dropped behind them, cutting off one corridor after another. The staff panicked. Holly's called for help. No response. The comms were still down. Alara ran. She ran because she had the only copy of the evidence. She ran because if they caught her, they would destroy it. She ran because someone had to survive long enough to tell someone what had happened here. She ran through corridors she knew, then corridors she didn't, because the bulkheads kept changing the layout and the security team was behind her. And she was 90 seconds from the airlock when she realized she didn't recognize the corridor. The ship waiting outside massed 40,000 tons. The storage bay was cold, not the controlled cold of the outpost's climate system, the hungry cold of a ship that had been traveling through empty space for too long. Alara's breath made small clouds in the air. Commander Vethkor stood in the doorway, blocking the only exit. His third eye tracked her pulse. The other 2 watched her hands, the right one still gripping the crowbar, the left one pressed against the storage container behind her. "You weren't supposed to be here," he said again. The words landed the same way they had on the outpost, in the relay room in the corridor, measured, unhurried, a man stating facts. "Neither were you," she said. The third eye blinked. It was the first time she had seen it happen. The center eye, the one that never blinked, the one that had tracked her pulse for 2 days, it closed for a fraction of a second, then opened. "He's rattled." She didn't know why, she didn't care, she just needed to keep him talking. "Your ship," she said, 40,000 tons, military class, no diplomatic markings. "You arrived 72 hours early with a security team that surveyed our outpost instead of protecting your delegation." She paused. "You were never here for cultural exchange." Vethkor's expression didn't change. "No. The relay node, you've been using it to map our fleet movements. 9 years, through 3 other outposts that were conveniently decommissioned after your visits." He tilted his head, a small gesture, almost curious. "You found the files." "I'm an archivist, it's what I do." "You are a clerk who was in the wrong place at the wrong time." Alara's grip tightened on the crowbar. 72 hours ago, I was filing agricultural requests. Now I'm standing on your ship with your blood on my hands. She looked down at her torn robe. The wet patch had spread. Not my blood, Vethkor said. No, one of your security team, the one who tried to grab me in the maintenance bay. He'll live. You struck a diplomatic attaché. I struck a soldier who was helping you erase an outpost. The silence between them lasted 4 seconds. Alara counted. Vethkor stepped into the bay, not toward her, toward the center of the room where the lighting was brightest. He wanted her to see his face clearly. She understood the tactic. It meant he was about to tell her something he wanted her to believe. The outpost, he said, was never diplomatic. I figured that out. It was a listening post built by your people, staffed by your people, positioned above a relay node that your military forgot to decommission properly. He spread his hands. We merely took advantage. You spied on us for 9 years. We observed your species is young, Admiral Voss's predecessor would say. He stopped. The third eye twitched. Alara filed the name, Admiral Voss's predecessor, someone before Voss, someone who had dealt with the Veth before. You've done this before, she said. 3 outposts, 3 delegations. 3 times you arrived early, surveyed the facility, transmitted fleet telemetry back to your space, and then what happened to the outposts? Vethkor was quiet for a moment, then he said they were decommissioned. By you. By your own command, budget cuts, strategic realignment. The official reasons were always plausible. By the time anyone noticed the pattern, the outposts were empty and the relays were dark. But not this one. Alara's voice was steady. This one you couldn't wait for decommissioning because we found the Vin corridor, because we pushed 7 sectors closer to your space in 10 years, because we weren't supposed to be expanding that fast and you needed to know why. The third eye blinked again. You're not wrong, Vethkor said. He walked to the storage container nearest her. Not threatening, not casual either, just moving, as if the conversation had reached a point where standing still felt wrong. The Vin corridor changed the mathematics, he said. Before it, your species was a curiosity, small fleet, old weapons, soft bodies that needed pressurized suits to walk in space. You were not a threat. We're still not a threat, we just want to be left alone. No, you want to expand, you want to settle new sectors, build research stations, raise families where no families have been before. He looked at her. That is what threatening species do. We're not threatening. You pushed 7 sectors closer to our space in 10 years. You did it quietly, steadily, without asking permission. That is exactly what a threatening species does before it attacks. Alara laughed. It came out wrong, too loud, too sharp, the sound of someone who had run out of fear and found something harder underneath. We didn't push toward you, she said. We pushed away from Earth. You just happened to be in the direction we were going. That is not how the Council sees it. I don't care how the Council sees it. The Council sent 300 ships to Earth 5 years ago. You were part of that fleet, weren't you? Part of the 300. Vethkor's hands curled at his sides. I was. You met with Admiral Voss, you sat in her ship, drank her coffee, watched her smile, and then you withdrew. We withdrew because she had seeds, 14,000 of them, threaded through your formation, invisible, waiting. Alara's voice was flat. I read the file. I read all the files. Your species has been trying to map human weaknesses for 11 years, and every time you think you found one, we've already built something to fill the gap. Vethkor was silent. That's why you're here, she said. Not to spy, not to survey, to find out what we built this time, because you don't know anymore. Because after Voss, after the seeds, after the Council withdrew with 14,000 invisible things writing home in their formation gaps, you realized you had no idea what we were capable of. The third eye blinked. Yes, he said. The confession landed in the cold air between them. Alara felt it settle on her shoulders like a weight she hadn't asked for. She was not a soldier. She was not a diplomat. She was an archivist who had been covering a colleague's shift when the Veth arrived 72 hours early. Her training was in preservation, not combat. Her tools were data cylinders and filing systems, not crowbars and pressure doors. But she had the evidence. The cylinder was still in the ventilation shaft back on the outpost, unless they had found it, unless they had already wiped it, unless... No, they didn't find it. They sealed off sections, but they didn't search every room. They were too confident, too sure that no one had seen what Vethkor was doing in the relay room. She had seen, she had copied, and the cylinder was still there. You're not going to kill me, she said. Vethkor's third eye tracked her pulse. I am considering it. You're not, because if you kill me, you have to explain why. And if you explain why, you have to admit that a single archivist with a data cylinder and a crowbar figured out what your entire intelligence network missed for 9 years. The silence stretched. Your species, Vethkor said slowly, has an unusual relationship with fear. We've had practice. You run toward things that should terrify you. You hide evidence in ventilation shafts when you should be running for airlocks. You strike soldiers with maintenance equipment and then stand in dead-end storage bays and negotiate. He paused. It is not rational. No, she said, it's not. The fire suppression system triggered at 1642. Alara had palmed the manual release on her way into the bay, a small button hidden behind a conduit, placed there for emergencies that never happened. She had pressed it 3 minutes ago when Vethkor was still walking toward the center of the room. The delay was deliberate. She had counted on it. The foam came from the ceiling vents in a white chemical flood. It was cold, colder than the ship's air, cold enough to make her gasp, and it tasted like metal and something sweet, something that coated her throat and made her eyes water. Vethkor reacted not with panic. He was too controlled for panic, but with confusion. His head turned. His hands came up. The third eye tracked the foam's source, then tracked her. She was already moving. The crowbar swung in an arc that started at her hip and ended at his temple. She had never hit anyone before. She had never needed to. Her training had covered filing. The impact was not a crack. It was a wet, muffled sound, like dropping a bag of vegetables on a stone floor. Vethkor fell. His third eye stayed open, the other two closed. Alara stood over him for 1 second. 2. Her pulse was loud in her ears, louder than the foam still spraying from the ceiling, louder than the distant sound of the security team shouting somewhere on the other side of the pressure door. It took 0.8 seconds from the moment she swung to the moment he fell. She had no way of measuring that, but she felt it. 0.8 of a second stretched across an eternity. His weapon had skittered across the floor during the fall. She picked it up, cold, heavier than it looked, the grip textured with something that wasn't quite metal, and tucked it into her robe. Then she ran. The pressure door cycled open at 1644. She stepped over Vethkor's body, not dead, she checked. His chest was still moving, and into the corridor beyond. The foam followed her, dripping from her robe, her hair, her eyelashes. The security team was 3 intersections away. She could hear them shouting in their own language, the translator catching fragments. Commander down and seal the bay, and human female armed. She wasn't armed, not really. The crowbar was a tool. The weapon in her robe was unfamiliar, untested, and probably keyed to Vethkor's biometrics. But they didn't know that. She turned left at the next intersection, then right, then left again. The ship's layout was still wrong. Corridors that should have led to the docking tube opened into storage bays, maintenance shafts, empty crew quarters. She was lost. Not lost, redirected. They're hurting me. She stopped running. The corridor was empty. The shouting had faded. The foam had stopped dripping from the ceiling. She had left the fire suppression zone behind. A hatch on her left, a maintenance access. The label was in Veth script, untranslated. She opened it. The shaft was dark, tight, designed for someone smaller than a human. She squeezed through anyway, feeling the metal press against her shoulders, her hips, the crowbar catching on a conduit and almost dropping. She climbed. Up, always up. The docking tube was on the upper deck. The outpost was through the docking tube. The ventilation shaft on the outpost, her quarters, her bunk, the loose grate was through the docking tube. The cylinder, someone will need the information. She climbed for what felt like hours. It was probably 7 minutes. The hatch at the top opened onto the docking tube access corridor. Empty. The security team had pulled back to the bay to Vethkor to regroup. Lara ran. The docking tube was sealed. Of course it was sealed. They had triggered the emergency lockdown when she ran. The pressure door between the ship and the outpost was closed, the seals engaged, the atmosphere vented from the tube. She pressed her palm against the viewport. The outpost was on the other side, dark. The lights had gone out during the sealing, or maybe they had been turned off. Maybe the Veth had cut power to delay any reinforcements. Maybe the staff was already. No, they wouldn't kill 42 people. Not yet. Not when they still needed the cover of a diplomatic visit. She turned away from the viewport. The maintenance panel was on the wall beside the tube. Standard design, the Veth used the same access protocols as humans, same emergency overrides, same wiring schematics. She had read about this once in a file about first contact engineering standards. Someone standardized the emergency systems across species. Someone thought it would save lives. She pried open the panel with the crowbar. The wiring was color-coded, blue for atmosphere, red for power, green for seals. She pulled the green wire. The docking tube cycled open with a hiss of escaping air. The atmosphere she had vented when she triggered the lockdown, or maybe the Veth had vented it. Maybe they had been trying to trap her on the ship. She didn't care. She ran through the tube, through the outpost's docking collar, through the pressure door on the other side, into the corridor she had left 90 minutes and a lifetime ago. The outpost was dark, but the emergency lights were on red, low, casting long shadows across the walls. She ran. Her quarters were on deck 3. The ventilation shaft was still open, the grate was still loose, the cylinder was still there. She grabbed it, checked the data, still intact, still readable, and tucked it into her robe next to Vethkor's weapon. Then she sat down on her bunk and waited. The reinforcements arrived 14 hours later. Not from Earth Command. The communications array was still jammed, the relay node still transmitting, the outpost still dark. The reinforcements came from a civilian freighter, the Rawson's Wake, a bulk carrier that had been passing through the system on a trade route that didn't exist anymore. They had heard the cylinder's emergency beacon. It was a failsafe she hadn't known existed. Dr. Eris had built it into the brass casing years ago, a low-frequency transmitter, battery-powered, designed to activate if the cylinder went more than 12 hours without being synced to a human database. Someone will need this information. He had built it for her for exactly this. The freighter's crew found her sitting on her bunk, still wearing the torn archival robe, still holding the cylinder, still not quite believing she was alive. They asked her what had happened. She told them. The military arrived 3 days later. By then, the Veth ship was gone, Vethkor was gone, his security team was gone, the outpost was empty except for the 42 staff members alive, unharmed, confused, and the data cylinder in Alara's hand. She gave her statement. She handed over the cylinder. She watched as the intelligence officers copied the files, verified the transmission logs, traced the relay node's 9-year data stream back to a receiver in Veth space. "They're not going to admit it," one of the officers said. "They'll claim the node was decommissioned. They'll claim the data was residual. They'll claim the delegation was diplomatic and your presence in the relay room was a misunderstanding." Alara looked at him. "I have Vethkor's weapon. That's not evidence of espionage. That's evidence of a scuffle. I have his confession on the cylinder. He admitted they were mapping our fleet." The officer was quiet for a moment. Then he said that might be enough. Months passed. Outpost Theta 9 was decommissioned. Official reason: budget cuts, strategic realignment. The same words Vethkor had used to describe the other 3 outposts. But this time someone noticed the pattern. The cylinder's data was entered into the permanent archive, restricted, classified, buried under layers of security clearances. But it was there. Someone would need it someday. Alara was reassigned to Earth, a desk job, filing. She requested a different posting, something farther out, something near the border, something where she could watch. Denied. She requested a transfer to intelligence analysis. Denied. She requested a meeting with Admiral Voss. Approved. They met in a conference room on Earth. Gray walls, gray table. Gray light from the window. It was raining outside, the kind of rain that made everything look soft and unfocused. Admiral Voss looked the same as she did in the files. Short hair, dark skin, a face that was very still, not cold, just still, like something that had learned not to show its calculations. "You're the archivist from Theta 9, Voss said. "Yes." "The one who hid the evidence in a ventilation shaft and hit a Veth intelligence officer with a crowbar." Alara nodded. Voss was quiet for a moment, then she smiled. It was a small smile, patient, the kind of smile that had faced 300 ships and served them coffee. "We could use people like you," she said. "Doing what?" "Watching, waiting, being in the wrong place at the wrong time with a data cylinder and a stubborn refusal to die." Alara thought about it. She thought about Dr. Eris, about the cylinder he had given her, about the words he had said. Someone will need this information. "I'm an archivist," she said. "It's what I do." Voss's smile didn't change. "Good, because we have a lot of files that need filing, and a lot of people who think we're not paying attention." The junior archivist found the report 6 months later. It was her first week in the classified archive, a basement room with no windows, cold air, and shelves that stretched into fluorescent-lit darkness. Her supervisor had given her a list of files to catalog. Most of them were routine: agricultural exchange requests, trade route analyses, diplomatic correspondence. The report on Theta 9 was not routine. She pulled the cylinder from its storage container, brass, old, a dent on one side where something had struck it, and inserted it into the reader. The file opened. A name: Ven E. Senior Archivist Alara Ven, deceased. The junior archivist read the report twice. The first time, she read it as a cataloger, checking dates, verifying references, noting cross-links to other files. The second time, she read it as a person. The Veth ship massed 40,000 tons. Ven was unarmed when she boarded it. She had a data cylinder and a crowbar and a robe that was never designed for running. She survived. She came back. She filed the report. The junior archivist sat back in her chair. The basement was quiet. The air filters hummed. Somewhere above, on the surface, the rain was falling. She looked at the cylinder's indicator light. It was blinking once, pause once. Still transmitting. She didn't know what it was transmitting. She didn't know who was listening. She didn't know if anyone would ever need the information locked inside the brass casing, waiting in the dark. But she turned off the light. The cylinder's indicator blinked again. Then the room was dark and the rain was falling, and somewhere in the classified archive of a species that had been knocked down more times than anyone had counted, a small brass cylinder sat on a metal shelf and waited. Someone would need it someday. That was the job.